Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video, we're going to study Job 23 and 24 and learn how to be humble when we are successful. The Bible tells us there was a man named Job who was exceedingly upright. Job 23 and 24 tell us Job knew he was upright and he vigorously defended his integrity when he was falsely accused of sinning. For us, this raises the question of how we stay humble when we know we have achieved excellence, but we're in a situation where we need to defend or promote ourselves. In this video, we're going to learn the key to staying humble is being filled with love, regarding others as more important than ourselves, and keeping worldly possessions in proper perspective. Now, let's start with a timeline to establish some context. This timeline starts at 4000 BC, goes up through the birth of Christ to 2000 AD. The Old Testament covers a time period from 4000 BC to 400 BC. The New Testament covers the 1st century AD. The Old Testament is divided into 5 groups: books of the law, history, poetry, the major prophets, and the minor prophets. Now, for most of the books of the Bible, it's important to understand where they fall on this timeline in order to fully grasp what the book is saying. The book of Job is a little bit unique in this way compared to the other books of the Bible because the historical context of Job is not nearly as important. The book of Job is a story that stands all alone. Having said that, the consensus is Job lived sometime around 2000 BC, and that would have placed him before most of the books of the Bible, before most of the events that are recorded in the Bible. Now let's review Job's story. At the beginning of the book of Job, Job was healthy and wealthy and wise. And Job 1 verse 1 says this about Job. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. And so Job starts out by telling us that Job was exceptionally upright. And keep that in mind as we go through today's passage. There's a dialogue in heaven between Yahweh and Satan. And Yahweh pointed out to Satan how Job was very upright. Satan responded by saying the only reason Job was upright and followed God was because Job was wealthy. Satan said that if Job would lose all his possessions, then he would curse God. So Yahweh gave Satan permission to go out and test Job. So Satan went out and destroyed all Job's possessions. He killed Job's children, and he afflicted Job with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. Well, Job did not curse God. At that point, 3 friends came to visit Job: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And then there was a long dialogue that took place between these 4 men. Job spoke first, then Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Job, then Zophar, and that pattern kept repeating. The general gist of this dialogue was the 3 friends tried to convince Job he was suffering because he had sinned. Job's response was to proclaim his innocence, and Job kept asking why God was against him and why God was afflicting him like this. The passage we're going to look at today is Job 23 and 24. It's represented by this red box here. As you can see, we're getting towards the latter end of this dialogue between these 4 men. Now, it helps to understand a little bit about Hebrew poetry as we go through this. It's different than English poetry. English poetry is all about rhyme. For example, roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. English poetry is about rhyme. Hebrew poetry is not about rhyme. Hebrew poetry is about repetition, addition, and contrast. In repetition, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then says the same thing in different ways. In addition, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then adds something to that concept. In contrast, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then says the opposite. Let me also say something about inspiration of the Holy Spirit and biblical inerrancy. These terms apply to the author of the book of Job. Job and his friends were not the author, and so what Job and his friends said was not necessarily correct. Inspiration and inerrancy mean the author of Job accurately recorded what Job and his friends said. That does not mean that they were correct in what they said. Now, with that as a background, let's get started. Job 23, verse 1. Then Job replied, "Even today my complaint is rebellion. God's hand is heavy despite my groaning." Now, when reading the Bible, in many passages, it's very important to understand who the pronouns refer to in order to understand the passage. And as you'll see here, I have brackets after pronouns to specify who that particular pronoun refers to. In this case, Job is talking and he says, God's hand is heavy despite my groaning. Now there's an assumption here. Job assumed that God is the one who was afflicting him. We know from Job 1 and 2 that that was not true. Satan was the one who was afflicting Job. Job and his friends were not aware of this dialogue that has taken place in heaven between Yahweh and Satan, and so Job and his friends did not know the truth about why Job was really suffering. Verse 3, and this is Job speaking. Oh, that I knew where I might find God, that I might come to his seat. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. Notice this phrase, present my case, and the word arguments. There's an assumption here. Job wanted to present his case before God. Job wanted to stand before God and argue with God. And there's an assumption here. Job was assuming that God did not know that Job was suffering. Well, we know from Job 1 and 2 that God did know that Job was suffering. And again, Job didn't know that. So Job was assuming God did not know that he was suffering. That's why Job wanted to stand in front of God and present his case and argue for some relief from his suffering. Now, we oftentimes want to do the same thing. Sometimes we're in a situation where we want to be able to go to God and stand in front of him and ask him questions and get some audible feedback and get some audible answers about why life is the way it is and why things are happening to us. And that's essentially what Job wanted here. Verse 5. Again, this is Job speaking. I would learn the words which he would answer and perceive what he would say to me. Would he contend with me by the greatness of his power? No. Surely he would pay attention to me. Now, notice the word greatness. Job asked, would God contend with me by the greatness of his power? So Job acknowledges God's greatness. But that's interesting because he has this question here, would God contend with me? And Job's answer was no. Surely God would pay attention to me. And it seems to me, it's a bit of a contradiction there. On the one hand, to acknowledge God's greatness, but then for Job to insist that God would have to pay attention to Job. And it raises the question, was Job getting desperate? Or was he getting arrogant that he thought God would have to pay attention to him? Think about, in light of that, think about Psalm 8, verses 3 and 4, which says, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him? And so we see that compared to the size of the universe and the size of the earth and all the moon and the stars, we humans are insignificant. Think also about the population of the earth. Today there is around 7 billion people on the earth. I am just one of 7 billion people. You are just one of 7 billion people. I don't know what the population was when Job lived, but he was just one person out of many that lived on earth. And so when you think about the population and our small part of it and how tiny we are and insignificant we are compared to the size of the earth, we really should understand that we are small and insignificant. And in light of that, we really should not be saying things like, surely God would have to pay attention to us, or Job should not have been saying that surely God would have to pay attention to him. Verse 7. There, before God, the upright would reason with God, and I would be delivered forever from my judge. Notice the word judge. Again, Job was assuming that God was judging him. And we know from Job 1 and 2 that that was not correct. God was not judging Job. That's not why these things were happening to Job. Notice also these words, delivered forever. Job also made an assumption here that if he was able to stand in front of God and state his case, that God would make things fair. And that was not a correct assumption either, because we see from Job's story, when we read Job 1 and 2 and see what happened to Job, the fairness was not part of God's thinking in this. God was trying, all these things happened to Job because God was trying to make a point to Satan, and God was not going to make things fair for Job. It wasn't fair for a righteous man like Job to suffer everything that he suffered, but fairness to Job was not the point. God making a point to Satan was the objective. Verse 8. Behold, I go forward, but God is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. When God acts on the left, I cannot behold him. He turns on the right, I cannot see him. Notice the words perceive and behold and see. In this case, Job wanted to stand in front of God and make visual contact with him, and again, state his case and argue for relief. And again, we often do the same thing. We're often in a situation where we want to be able to see God. Contrasted with this, in our lives, if we want to go talk to our boss or a coach or a government official, we can go to them, we can see them, we can perceive them, make eye contact with them, we can have an audible conversation with them and get some feedback and get some answers. That's what Job wanted to do with God. He wanted to see him face to face, make eye contact with him, and ask his questions and get some answers. And just like we can't do that, Job was not able to do that either. Verse 10. But God knows the way I take. When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot has held fast to his path. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the command of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. Now again, Job 1 and 2 tells us that Job was indeed the greatest man in the East. Job 1 tells us that Job was upright and God-fearing. And we see through these last couple verses that Job knew that he was upright. But that raises the question, was Job justified in saying this about himself? Even more importantly, it raises the questions, if we're in a situation like Job, where either life is not fair, or we have to defend ourselves or promote ourselves, are we justified in touting ourselves? Are we justified in listing our accomplishments? Are we justified in telling other people what our strengths are and when we're good, when we do things that are right? I'll come back to that question later. Verse 13. But God is unique, and who can turn him? And what his soul desires, that he does. For God performs what is appointed for me, and many such decrees are with him. Therefore, I would be dismayed at his presence. When I consider, I am terrified of him. It is God who has made my heart faint, and the Almighty who has dismayed me. Notice the word dismayed, and terrified, and faint, and then we have dismayed again. Job was afraid of God, and that was good. Proverbs tell us the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. And so it was wise for Job to be afraid of God. Now, it seems to be a bit of a contradiction. We had that verse earlier where Job insisted that surely God would have to listen to Job. And so in that case, it seemed like Job was not expressing any fear of God. But in this case, Job is clearly indicating that if indeed he was going to be in God's presence, he was in some sense, as much as Job wanted to be in front of God, at the same time he was terrified of that thought, which is correct. Verse 17. But I am not silenced by the darkness, nor deep gloom which covers me. Why are times not stored up by the Almighty? And why do those who know him not see his days? Now there's two cryptic questions here. First, why are times not stored up by the Almighty? The question is, what does he mean by why are times? And why do those who know him not see his days? What does it mean to see his days? I think when he asks, why are times not stored up by the Almighty? I think what Job is asking is, why does God not put bad people on his naughty list? I think that's essentially what Job was trying to ask there. And when he talks about see his days, I think Job was referring to prosperity. So I think Job was asking, why do those who know God not see prosperity? So in other words, Job was asking here, I think, why do bad people prosper while good people suffer? I think that's essentially what Job was asking here. Now in the next 10 verses or so, which is going to be Job 24 verses 2 through 11, Job's going to make some statements about the realities of life. He's going to expand on this concept a little bit and list examples of how, he's going to list examples of the injustices of life. This is verse 2. Some people remove the landmarks. They seize and devour flocks. Now as we go through this, again, pay attention to the pronouns. In this case, the pronoun they refers to people who remove the landmarks. And as we go through this, sometimes the pronoun they refers to people who oppress others. Sometimes the pronoun refers to those who are oppressed. Or another way to say it, sometimes the pronoun they refers to bad people. Sometimes The pronoun they refers to the victims. Verse 3. They, those who oppress, they drive away the donkeys of the orphans. They take the widow's ox for a pledge. They push the needy aside from the road. The poor of the land are made to hide themselves altogether. Notice the word widow and orphan and needy, and also the poor. This is a common theme throughout the Bible. The Bible often makes reference to the widows and orphans and poor and needy. And there's a common theme throughout the Bible that it's important to take care of the widows and orphans and the poor and the needy. And Job is expressing that thought here. Job is criticizing those, or one of Job's examples of injustice is these people who are oppressing the widows and orphans and the poor and needy. Verse 5. Behold, as wild donkeys in the wilderness, the poor go forth, seeking food in their activity, as bread for their children in the desert. And so here we see that the pronoun they has changed. It's now referring to the poor or the oppressed. Verse 6. The poor harvest their fodder in the field and glean the vineyard of the wicked. They spend the night naked without clothing and have no covering against the cold. They are wet with the mountain rains and hug the rock for want of a shelter. Others snatch the orphan from the breast, and against the poor they take a pledge. They cause the poor to go about naked without clothing, and they take away the sheaves from the hungry. Again, we see the pronoun they has changed again. Now it's referring to oppressors. Verse 11. Within the walls the hungry produce oil. They tread wine presses but thirst. Notice here the injustice is that the people who work to tread out the wine do all the work to create this food and drink, but they're not able to partake of it themselves. Verse 12. From the city men groan, and the souls of the wounded cry out. Yet God does not pay attention to folly. Now notice these last two lines. The souls of the wounded cry out. The wounded refers to all these people who are oppressed, the widows, the orphans, the poor, and the needy, and they're crying out because of all of their wounds. They're crying out because of their suffering and their hurts. And notice the word yet. That's a contrast. So Job was saying that you have these hurting people who are crying out, yet, or but, God does not pay attention to folly. Folly would be the injustice of all these people who are oppressing the widows and orphans and poor and needy. And Job basically believed that all these people were suffering, but God's not paying attention to it. This ties in with Job's belief that God was not aware of Job's suffering. And again, as we know from Job 1 and 2, God did know about Job's suffering. It also raises the question, is this why Job was bragging, if indeed he was bragging, when Job talked about how he was upright? In other words, if Job believed that there was all this injustice in earth and God wasn't paying attention, maybe Job felt that it was up to him to state his case and defend himself because he believed that God wasn't going to defend him for him. That raises the question, do we do the same thing? Are we ever in situations where we believe that God's not paying attention to wrongdoers or evil people, and we feel like it's up to us to defend ourselves and state our own case? I'll come back to that later. Verse 13. Others have been with those who rebel against the light. They do not want to know its ways, nor abide in its paths. Notice this concept of rebelling against the light. Think of it this way, and this is something with our modern conveniences, we kind of lose sight of this, but in Job's day, they didn't have electricity. They didn't have electric lights. And so when the sun went down, activity essentially ceased because it was too dark to do anything. The only people that did not cease activity were the criminal element. And what we're going to see in the next few verses, verses 14 through 17, is Job is going to expand on this idea, and he's going to illustrate the misuse of darkness. So let's go to verse 14. The murderer arises at dawn, he kills the poor and the needy, and at night he is as a thief. The eye of the adulterer waits for the twilight, saying, no eye will see me, and he disguises his face. In the dark, notice this phrase, in the dark, the murderers and adulterers dig into houses. They shut themselves up by day. They do not know the light. For the morning is the same to an adulterer as thick darkness, for he is familiar with the terrors of thick darkness. They, the murderers and adulterers, are insignificant on the surface of the water. Their portion is cursed on the earth. They do not turn toward the vineyards. So we see in those previous verses, again, this concept that the murderers and adulterers do their thing at night because the good people aren't out, and they can use darkness as cover to hide the bad things that they're doing. Now here, we have this idea, this concept of being insignificant on the surface of the water. I think the concept here is Job is simply saying that all these murderers and adulterers, yes, they're doing all this bad stuff and they're getting away with it, but if you look at the big picture, if you would put them on the surface of the water, on the surface of the ocean or something, they would be very tiny and insignificant. Job was just pointing out how insignificant they were. There's this concept that they do not turn toward the vineyards. I think what Job meant was that the murderers and adulterers do not go to the vineyard and work for their food. Instead, they're out stealing and pillaging and getting their sustenance that way instead of working for it. Verse 19. Drought and heat consume the snow waters. So does Sheol those who have sinned. A mother will forget him. The worm feeds sweetly till he is no longer remembered, and wickedness will be broken like a tree. Now, this first line here says, Job said, a mother will forget him. And the question is, who does him refer to? Is Job saying that a mother will forget a son who sinned? Based on the context, I think that's what Job was saying. I'm not sure I agree with that. And remember, Job was not inspired, and so what Job is saying throughout this passage is not necessarily correct. But I think that's what Job meant, and I really don't agree with that. Let's go on to verse 21. He wrongs the barren woman and does no good for the widow. Now, I mentioned earlier it's important to understand who the pronouns refer to in order to understand this passage. And starting in verse 21 and through to verse 25, the pronouns are very vague. For example, in this case, is the pronoun he referred to God or a sinner? Is Job saying God wrongs the barren woman? Or does he say that there's an oppressor or a sinner out there who wrongs the barren woman? Verse 22. But he drags off the valiant by his power. He rises, but no one has assurance of life. And again, does he refer to God or an oppressor? Verse 23. He provides them with security and they are supported, and his eyes are on their ways. Again, does he refer to God or an oppressor? And does them refer to them and they? Does that refer to victims or persecutors? Again, in the context, it's not really quite clear. Verse 24. They are exalted a little while, then they are gone. Moreover, they are brought low, and like everything gathered up. Even like the heads of grain, they are cut off. And again, we have the pronoun they here, and the question is it referring to victims or persecutors? And again, with the context, it's not quite clear. I think what Job was saying through here is that he believes that God is the one who wrongs the widow because he supports the widow for a while, but then she is brought low and cut off. I think that's what Job was trying to say here through that. And in verse 25, and this is the last verse of the passage. Now, if it is not so, who can prove me a liar and make my speech worthless? And so Job issues a challenge here to his friends. He basically challenges them to try and prove him wrong. Now, overall, I think Job's point was he was suffering even though he had always followed God's commandments. Others were oppressing the poor and needy and getting away with it. Meanwhile, God wasn't doing anything to correct these injustices. I think this is a summary of what Job was essentially trying to say throughout this passage. And it's because of this belief that Job said what he said way back in the beginning of this passage in verse 3, where Job said, "Oh, that I knew where I might find God, that I might come to his seat. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn the words which he would answer and perceive what he would say to me. Would he contend with me by the greatness of his power? No, surely he would pay attention to me." So again, because Job believed there was all these inequities in life and God wasn't paying attention, Job wanted to go to God and be in front of him and state his case, and he believed that surely God would have to pay attention to him. And as I mentioned earlier, this raises the question, was Job just desperate here, or was he getting arrogant that he thought that God would have to pay attention to him? Then a little bit later, Job said this, God knows the way I take. When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot has held fast to his path. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the command of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Job 1 and 2 tell us that Job was indeed blameless, and so Job was correct when he stated that he had, was holding fast to God's path and he had not turned aside from God's way. Job was correct about that, but it does raise the question, was Job still being humble when he said this? And was he justified in saying this? Was he justified in touting his own accomplishments? But then even more importantly, if we're in a situation like Job, where we are suffering and or we're falsely accused, as Job was, if we're falsely accused or if we're overlooked, are we justified in touting ourselves? Are we justified in proclaiming our own accomplishments and our own goodness and uprightness? Well, to answer that, let's take a look at some other verses in the New Testament. This is Romans 12:3. Paul wrote, "For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith." Notice this phrase, more highly. Paul said, do not think more highly. And so I believe it's okay for us to think highly of ourselves, just not more highly than we should. Notice also this phrase, sound judgment. Think so as to have sound judgment. So Paul said here, we're supposed to think accurately about ourselves. And so if we have accomplished something, if we are successful, if we have done the right thing, it is okay for us to acknowledge to ourselves that we have done the right thing. Having said that, it's still, the question remains, when we're interacting with other people, is it okay to talk about ourselves? And if so, how do we do that and still be humble? So let's look at 1 Corinthians 13:4. Love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant. Notice this statement, love does not brag. And so if we're in a conversation with someone and we truly love that person, then we will not brag. But then conversely, if we're talking about ourselves to people that we don't love, then the chances are we are bragging and we are being arrogant. And so if we're questioning whether it's okay to talk about ourselves, the first question we should ask is, do we love the person we're talking to? If we love them, then we probably will not brag. If we don't love them, then we might brag and be arrogant. Let's look also at Philippians 2, verse 3. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. So, again, we need to ask ourselves, if we're talking about ourselves, we should ask, are we doing it from selfishness? We should also ask, do we regard this other person as more important than ourselves? And, ultimately what we should be asking ourselves is, why are we talking about ourselves? And so what we see here is if we're talking about ourselves to exalt ourselves, then we are probably being conceited. Let's look also at 1 Timothy 6, verse 17. Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Notice the word rich and the word riches. And notice the command, do not fix our hope on the uncertainty of riches. In other words, don't fix our hope on the uncertainties of worldly possessions. And the conclusion from this is that if we rely on our worldly possessions for security or hope or status, then we're probably conceited. If we're conceited, then when we're talking to other people and we're talking about ourselves, we're probably going to end up not being humble. We're going to end up being bragging and being arrogant. So the conclusion for all this, the way to keep ourselves humble, even when we are successful, is to be filled with love, consider others more important than ourselves, and avoid fixing our hope on worldly possessions. If you'd like to receive the next episode of Bible Mountain via email, please visit www.biblemountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email feed. This is a free subscription and your email will not be sold nor given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.